Dr. J.W. Freiberg, welcome to Shrink Wrap Radio.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Well, I understand you like to be called by your nickname, Terry. Is that right?
Everyone's always called me that.
Uh-huh.
Please do.
Well, how come? Where did that come from? I
Oh,
can't
gracious. That's a
derive
whole
that
nother.
from J.W. Freiberg.
It has to do with World War II, with my mother and her girlfriend sitting on a beach, and they're both pregnant, and they picked out their favorite nickname for their upcoming kids. And each of us are called Terry, even though neither of us are really named that.
Interesting. Wow, that's a great story. It connects you to some history,
It
right?
does.
You're connected to the Second World War, even though you're too young to have been in it.
I wouldn't have been born but for the Second World War. My sisters are much older, and when Dad went off to fight, they decided to have one more child for some crazy reason. So I actually owe my life to the awful guy Hitler.
Yeah, really. Wow. So, lost my place here. We're going to be discussing loneliness, which is a very timely topic, I think, with some reference to your two books on loneliness. I think you have more than two in all, but we're going to be looking at Surrounded by Others and Yet So Alone, and a second book called Growing Up Lonely. And on the cover of Surrounded by Others book, there's a quote by one of my past guests, Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, who says, and I quote him, "What we have in Freiberg, I'm happy to say, is the Oliver Sacks of law," close quote. Now that's high praise indeed. I'm a big fan of Oliver Sacks. I'm a big fan of van der Kolk. And but after reading some of the compelling stories in your Surrounded by Others book, I have to say I strongly agree.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, so kudos to you.
Hmm.
What led you to choose narrative rather than academic prose in the case, call them case histories or case stories that appear in that book?
The breadth of the potential. My first two books, uh, they're on European topics, French topics, and they were very academic, and the number of people that could possibly have an interest in them was so limited. And after my career as a social psychology professor, I became an attorney, and I heard these case histories as stories. In other words, clinicians would call me up when they needed a legal consultation and say, "Wow, did I hear a story today
Huh.
in session and I need some legal consult? Do I call the police or do I call the social service agencies? What do I do?" So they came across to me as stories, and I just had the idea that I would be able to communicate what I had to say with so many more people.
Yeah,
But I do believe that everybody loves a story.
right, right. Some part of our brain is wired up to be particularly receptive to stories. And so I totally agree with you. How did you come by your storytelling skills? I mean, they seem rather advanced, I must say.
I don't do much else well. I don't know. I love telling stories. I think when my boys were little, I remember around camping in the summertime, fires and friends with their kids, and telling stories and watching the kids go quiet,
Mm,
active, wild little 7, 8, 9-year-old boys who were pretty hard to quiet on
yeah.
purpose. But when you told a story, something about it, something about the magic draw of the fire and a story around the
Oh,
fire got right through to these little piles of active wildness, and they quieted down and they listened intently.
that's a huge part of our whole history as human beings. I mean, it's just so basic. The around the fire and the storytelling experience. I think it's genetically imprinted in some ways. Um, so I'm curious about your background. Um, from the Surrounded by Others book, the first story in particular planted in my mind that I got the impression that you're a real Francophile. and that you're fluent in French. How did that come about?
Uh, as well as an academic, I mean, my mom was French speaking, so I grew up being disciplined in French. Um, and since I was
You mean when
relatively
you were in
naughty,
trouble? When you were in trouble, it would come out in French?
luckily I was a relatively naughty child, and so I
You
heard
got to learn
French.
a lot.
And then I fell in love with France. And if you get to the fifth story, which has the sort of leitmotif of bread running through it, when I finally was hitchhiking around France in the mid 1960s in the summer as a college student, I I didn't have any money to speak of, so I ate bread and cheese was all I could afford. And when I got to France, like everyone else, I fell in love with the bread, with the baguette, with the
Yeah,
croissant.
yeah,
And then as an academic, since I had this language skill, I was somewhat specialized in matters French and taught in Paris, held a position at a very interesting, it's called the Laboratory for the Study of Social Movements, to translate, and with Alan Touraine. So I spent two academic year and a half in France. Each time wrote one of those books I talked about that was overly academic and underly fun.
yeah,
and and so yes, I fell in love with France, French culture, French language, and stay that way till this day.
yeah, yeah. That's a wonderful second part of your brain to have there. How did you become interested in loneliness?
Well, so once I had the two degrees, once I had the law degree on top of the social psychology degree, which is in sociology, but my specialty was social
Right.
psychology, um, I pretty quickly was offered an interesting position. After law school, I went to a big monster law firm. You sort of flow out of this huge law school I went to in Cambridge, Mass, into a big firm. And after not so many years there, a smaller firm, a fellow I knew, a senior lawyer at another and much smaller firm, called me up and said, "Why don't you come over here and get out of that great big firm? You'll have a lovely life. You'll be in control of your timing.
Yay.
And there's these, I represent these social service agencies, and I can't do it anymore. They need someone younger and vibrant, and you've got that second degree, the PhD. They'll love that." So I became general counsel to half a dozen of Boston's most interesting social welfare agencies,
Wow.
uh, most of which were children's social welfare agencies, and then adoption agencies, and then private practices of mental health professionals of all three stripes. And so I was general counsel. And so what would happen would be that as the years went on, more and more clinicians called ever more often with their story about what they heard in session and what would be the legal implications of what they'd heard and what should they do. And as the years went on, over the last, say, 15 years, there were more and more stories of loneliness that children began to show up, besides the usual panoply of issues that they presented with. They also showed up with an enormous degree of disconnection and felt isolated in the world and lonely.
Mm.
And I didn't know anything about such matters, and neither did these most of the clinicians. It was just such a new cut on life because loneliness is a new thing in the world. It wasn't around. It hasn't been around very long.
Ah,
And so I set out to learn about it, and it turned out there was some interesting things to read, most of which was bad news about how hard loneliness is, both on psychological health and physical health. Greatly increases both morbidity and mortality. And the more interested I got, the bigger the phenomenon became. And finally, I set out to write a book on it just for fun. It also, of course, brought up connection, because you can't talk about loneliness without talking about connection, just as you can't talk about hunger without talking about food supply.
Yeah, as we're going to get to a part where you list kind of your theory of loneliness and five what you call misconnects or disconnects, and I couldn't help but think of attachment theory, and I wondered if that some of the brain mechanisms might be the same or similar.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's very interrelated.
Okay. And I was struck by what you just said, that loneliness is kind of a new thing. Can you say more about that? At what point in time would you say it began to be the phenomenon that it
Well,
is?
well, about 35% of the United States population, adult population, now self-identifies or tests out on the UCLA loneliness scale as chronically lonely. And that used to be 20% in 1990. So that's a huge, that's, not quite doubled, but almost doubled.
Wow,
Why? What's going on? And the
really?
more I read about and thought about what was going on in communal life, because if in any of our families, if you go back, I'm going to say 5 generations, maybe I'm wrong and it's 6 or 7, but something like that, not very much. There was no space for loneliness. Everybody grew up in a communal setting. You knew your parents knew all the other grown-ups in town. You knew the kids in town. You married somebody from that group of kids. A stranger was someone from out of town. You grew up around not just your siblings, but your cousins. Family was very important. So there just wasn't the social space
Hmm.
to be lonely in.
Hmm.
That's something we've created with industrial society and the diminution of family size.
Makes sense to me. Yeah. Wow. And um, and as you've already mentioned, you're a social psychologist. You were a social psychologist first,
Right.
and then became a lawyer. And I'm just wondering how those two perspectives, lenses, function for you in your work.
Well, I
Did they
always
each
tell people
provide
that,
something important?
um, well, it was entirely coincidental. In a sense, I mean, I was at Boston University where I just fought for my tenure and won my tenure. And all of a sudden I had a chance to go to Harvard Law School. And I told them a tale, because you have to make an entry essay. I said, I'll put the two trainings together. That was my story, because I was about
Yeah,
35 years old and most of their students, the substantial entirety of the students are 22-year-olds right out of
yeah,
college.
right.
And here I was, the old man of the class at age 35. And lo and behold, as I mentioned, even though I went out to a big firm, I got that phone call I described earlier and ended up putting the two careers together. So I practiced law, but the most interesting subtopic were these phone calls from clinicians asking me, telling me a case story. One, I would say just about once a day for 35 years.
Wow.
Case stories about this is what happened. This is Johnny's background. This is what his family is like. This is the circumstances he lives in. This is how he presents in clinical session. These are the legal issues I need you to answer. So I would obviously try my best to answer the legal question, but I couldn't deny the fact that this other training inside of me saw the story of Johnny's family and his reaction to his young life as a piece of de facto social science research. And in many of these cases, the level of specificity and detail is something that mental health professionals just never see. Uh, Let me give you one example. You talked about Bessel van der Kolk. We did a fabulous case together, fascinating case. It's actually the first story in another book I wrote called 4 Seasons of Loneliness, meaning young, medium, old, and elderly. So this
Okay.
was about a, a child or 2 children and their abusive home. But it was such a fascinating case that van der Kolk came in as my expert witness.
Great.
So we worked together for 2.5 years, I think, over the entire litigation. And by the time I deposed the children, along with 11 other attorneys, with a massive lawsuit. We
Wow.
had boxes and boxes of details about their lives. And then Dr. Vanderkolk had the children 3 2-hour clinical sessions, not treatment sessions, but discovery as to how they were doing, since he was the expert in the case as to whether they'd been damaged by, as the lawsuit claimed. We were on the defense side. So the level of detail that we got to in that case was beyond anything. We had thousands of pages, and we'd interviewed 80 witnesses, so we knew everything about that family and those children. So
Wow.
it was like hard science rather than social science. You know, we had so much data.
Yeah. I want to show people what your book looks like. I'm just remembering to kind of hold it up. It's about this thick, and it's a lovely cover. And the 5 stories that you recount in this book really move out of the realm of consulting with somebody over the phone to you out on the streets, becoming an investigator and actively involved in people's lives, and absolutely fascinating. And I think most of us, when we think about the law, loneliness would not come to mind, even as a topic. So I find that really fascinating. I was reminded of Mother Teresa, who ministered to the poor in Bangladesh and visited, that when she visited America, she observed that despite our relative material wealth, we seemed a lonely people compared to Bangladesh. That that certainly seems to draw a red line under what you've been saying.
Mhm.
Yeah. So do you also see loneliness as as particularly acute in our culture? I guess you must, because you've written a number of books about it.
I do, but I think Western industrial cultures in general are
Mhm,
experiencing a decent amount of what we are.
mhm.
The United Kingdom being the easiest example, because um, the previous prime minister created a new ministry, and so there's a minister for loneliness in the UK
Wow.
to deal with the issue. There are so many people, obviously, particularly senior citizens,
Right.
who are now alone and disattached from their families. Whereas in traditional English society, as throughout the continent, um, grandparents were part of a family and helped raise grandchildren. So people lived in multi-generation families, but those have so disappeared in obviously in our country and in the UK, and to some extent in the European countries that I'm familiar with, that older people live in, that we've created this phenomenon where we've developed senior living centers, or call
Yeah.
them what you will, where we
Warehousing.
shunt off
Yeah.
our older generation away from their family. So
Yeah.
that's new.
Yeah. I was struck by this. What did you call it? Not a department in the UK.
Yeah, the minister, it's a
The
full
ministry.
ministry. Yeah, he's
Yeah.
the minister of loneliness.
Uh, are they doing anything interesting about it?
Sure, they've developed all sorts of programs to try to reattach seniors, if not to their own families, to other younger, to middle-aged and younger people through various kinds of programs.
And
But
I gather any governmental uh, initiatives in our country would be more fragmented and scattered. Would I be right about that? Or non-existent?
yeah, I give up trying to figure out our country at the moment. I don't know what we're going to do with any issue.
Yeah, really, particularly today.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, most of us are enmeshed. It seems paradoxical, I think, to many people, considering that most of us, are enmeshed in a network of family and friends and jobs, and yet so many people still feel lonely despite all of that.
Well, one of the things that I've tried to take a close look at is that there are two different pathways to loneliness. My first book, Four Seasons of Loneliness, talks about isolation and disconnection. That's an obvious pathway to loneliness. It's far from the case that everybody who lives alone is chronically lonely, but one is very vulnerable, and that is a possibility, is to end up
Mhm.
lonely. But only roughly half of people who score as chronically lonely on this incredibly valid and reliable test we have called the UCLA Loneliness Scale, version 3. The other half are surrounded by wives or husbands or siblings or friends or workmates or neighbors or teammates, but subjectively, they feel just as lonely as the isolated, disconnected people do. There's something about relationships in the modern world that are difficult enough to sustain, that people can be involved with many others and yet still feel so terribly isolated.
Hmm. And you speak of chronic loneliness as a sensation, which is interesting, rather than an emotion.
Yes, and I think that's, for me, a very important place to start. Um, what I mean by saying it's a sensation is that it's exactly parallel to hunger, thirst, and fear, other sensations.
Mhm.
And these all come to us from our animal being, not from being human. A deer, a squirrel, other animals also feel hunger, thirst, and they have been in effect trained and patterned by their parents when they were being raised, as to how to find safety and how to find hydration and how to find food, how to fly, how to run, how to hide, how to dig, all those skills they need. Um, so, so for me, the sensation, just as the sensation of hunger arrives to our forebrain from our parietal lobe, from our animal brain, we feel hunger before we think hunger. We suddenly come upon the feeling of hungry. And then we, as humans, say to ourselves, oh, well, maybe I'll get Chinese takeout tonight or whatever. We deal with the issue of hunger in our way. But the feeling arrives from our inner being, from our animal self, from our brainstem, from another part of us. And for some mammals, and some other animals too, but let's stick with mammals, such as elephants, some of the great apes, and the cetacean mammals, so that's the whales, the dolphins, and the porpoises. Like us, we're all family-based, small pod herd animals. That's how we live, among others. All of these kind of mammals.
Yeah.
And so the sensation of of hunger comes to us, and just parallel to that, the sensation of disconnection comes to us, because we're built to be connected, just as elephants are, or the
Yeah.
cetacean mammals. We're built to be around family and small circles of acquaintances as they are, and we feel uncomfortable to be separated because it's unsafe. And in the traditional world, it was super unsafe. And by the way, it's interesting to think about medieval Europe, when one of the greatest punishments, if they didn't cut your head off because you did something so awful, but if you were going, they were going to let you live but punish you sincerely, what did they do? They banished you. They put you outside the town walls, and
Right.
you were on your own, which was probably very akin to a death sentence, or nearly so
Yeah.
in that time. We're not built to be separated. It hurts to be separated. So the sensation comes to us the way fear and hunger and thirst do, from
Mhm.
inside our body. It's not an intellectual construct in its essence.
Yeah.
It's a sensation.
Yeah. That's so interesting. I really want to dwell with that some more and yeah, inside myself. What comes to mind too is uh, the teenagers who are in such crisis when they are targeted online and kind of sent to Coventry, if you will, set aside, banned, and and that can lead to suicide, among other severe problems. And in the context of what you're saying, that really makes sense. Okay, well, you've developed your own theory based on what you call misconnection and lonely lives, and you list 5 types of misconnections. And we'll step through those 5, if you will. And in this book that I keep referring to of yours, wonderful book, um, you have a case story that illustrates each of them. So I don't know if we'll have time to share the case story for each of them, but maybe for a couple of them at least. So I'll just read the 5 first off, and then we can kind of step through them in whatever way makes sense to you.
Sure.
By the way, I forgot to ask you if you're kind of open-ended on your time. Do you have an appointment coming up at the top of the hour or anything?
At the top of the hour would probably be a good time to cut off.
Okay, so we'll keep that in the back of our minds.
Sure.
So the 5 that you list are tenuous connections, one-way connections, fraudulent connections, obstructed connections, and dangerous connections. So let's start with number 1, tenuous connections. Take us through that, if you will.
So let me say one thing first and then answer your question. I did not make a theoretical foray into these 5 types of poor connections, 5 types of relationships that are so unsatisfying to people that they feel lonely. They came from the real world. The law cases that I described earlier, the consultations that mental health professionals sought from me on the legal matters, the clients that they described, patients or clients that they described, fell into 5 piles. So that's where this comes from. It's not science. It's just what I saw in about 1,200 of these cases.
So it's good, solid qualitative research, I would say.
Yeah, it's just qualitative, but it certainly was a decent number over about 35 years. And that's how they fell out.
Okay.
So you asked about tenuous connection. So the idea there is simply that some people's connections with others in their lives are troubled by the impermanency or how they experience. They don't feel confident that the relationships will last. There is doubt and uncertainty involved, and obviously sound relationships, family relationships almost by definition, but even sound friendships are all about consistency and constancy and long-term perspectives. You don't make a friend for a month. You make a friend and you hope to keep that friend as the years go by. Obviously, that was easier in traditional society when you lived down the street from one another. Now everybody's so mobile that people move out of your lives because they get a new job or their mate does or something changes or they're chasing grandchildren to another city. So the idea of a tenuous connection is a connection that is worrisome and not fulfilling because of its impermanency.
And that must happen in families some of the time as well.
It does sometimes. And the case study I put in the book is about a little girl who was being raised by her mother and her stepfather. And the mother at age 33 had a completely unexpected stroke and passed away. And the stepfather, who was a wonderfully loving dad, found that he had no legal relationship left with that child at all, because he'd never married and performed what we call a step-parent adoption, which is the way he could have actually not just become the father of the child legally, but also actually had his name transferred onto an amended birth certificate.
Yeah.
That didn't happen. So here this little girl, I think she was 6 during most of the case. She didn't only lose her mother, but she came within an inch of losing her father. And there was this enormous custody battle where her father, aided by the biological father of the little girl, who came over from France to help, thank goodness, and that's why we were able to prevail in the lawsuit. So that was one side of the lawsuit that I was representing. The other side was an estranged grandmother and her husband, who lived in a tiny town in Texas and had really never seen the child except for 2 days after she was born. And so we had our job was to convince the judge to leave the little girl in the life she knew with her stepfather, joined by her biological father and these who had his own family over in Paris. But these two would make a better family for this little girl than these grandparents who she didn't know and who lived in the opposite kind of lifestyle that she had been accustomed to.
Yeah. Well, it really illustrates your point about tenuous connections, but also the story is so brilliantly told. Made me wonder if you're familiar with the work of the famous hypnotherapist Milton Erickson.
I am familiar, but marginally.
Yeah, well, he told great tales as well about his clinical work, and he was unusual in really getting his hands wet in a way in terms of coming up with practical applications in people's lives, non-obvious, subtle rearrangements of one sort or another. And you seem to share a similar gift. And in this case that you just so quickly related, there's so many complexities, and you travel back and forth between the US and France, and you're getting really learning about these people's lives and trying to come up with a magical solution in a sense that makes everybody happy. Let's move on to the next one. One-way connections. What are we getting at there?
Well, sometimes people are in relationships for different reasons, and the story I tell there is of a Chinese opera star and a French diplomat who get involved in a relationship that is played out beautifully in the Broadway Tony Award-winning play M. Butterfly. And Jeremy Irons made a great movie, also called the letter M, Butterfly, that one can find on YouTube. And the idea there was that they had very different reasons for entering the relationship. The Frenchman was seeking love and did fall in love and remained in love for the 30-year span of the relationship. But it turned out that the Chinese opera star with whom he fell in love in Beijing, China, was involved in the relationship as a honeypot scheme for the Chinese police. So he made this relationship in order to have access to the French embassy and its documents, whereas the Frenchman was looking for love. So they were involved in the same relationship, but for entirely different reasons. And obviously, that is an explosive circumstance that it eventually came to light. It's a fascinating story because when they were caught, the Chinese police threatened both of them and the Chinese opera star. The French diplomat stole documents from the French embassy and delivered them to the Chinese police. And when these two were later in life in France, the French government figured it out and tried them for high treason, convicted them, and sent them to prison. So it's quite a fascinating story, and was made into this magnificent Broadway drama called M. Butterfly. But it's a story of what happens when people are in a relationship for very different reasons. That's, for want of a better term, I called it a one-way type of relationship.
Now, the next one is called fraudulent connections, and the one that you just described almost sounds like it could be seen as a fraudulent connection.
Yeah, I think you could, but that's why I say don't put a lot of stock in the categories. I just found 5 great stories that seem to me to talk about the way relationships can be so structurally poorly put together that they end up being not fulfilling, and hence leaving people feeling isolated and lonely, even though they're involved in relationships.
So give us an example of the fraudulent connection.
Well, let me give you a great example. It's a different one than I give in the book. I once received a phone call at about 1 a.m. from a past client who said, "Can you please come down to Boston Logan Airport? I'm here with my cousin and she's got a problem." And when I go down there, I learn the following has happened. The cousin had gone to Miami for a week-long winter vacation. She was a graduate student, almost at the end of her PhD studies. There she met and fell head over heels in love with an Englishman. And he then followed her back to when she returned to Boston after a week. He would come up on every other weekend and rent expensive rooms and court her. Not too many months later, they were married. She sort of broke with her family. They thought this was happening way too quick and that she shouldn't be giving up her wonderful career as an art history graduate student. And then they had they became pregnant, and suddenly he announced that his sort of mysterious business required him to move first to Montreal and then to London. But when they came through Logan Airport, he was arrested. And that's what I was being called. And when I went down to Logan Airport early that morning to talk to the police about what the issues were, I learned that this man not only was not English, he was American. He faked the English accent. He faked his entire background about having gone to Eton and Oxford and had this sophisticated English upbringing. He lied about how his money was made. He said it was family money and he did some international stock and trading kinds of things. In reality, he was a drug dealer. So he had completely lied to her from the beginning about everything.
Drug dealer and con man, it sounds like.
Complete con man.
Yeah.
So here she was, married and quite pregnant. And the police grabbed this guy. And I tried to bargain with them a little bit on extradition and so on, and they could have cared less. They had 1,000% of the evidence they needed to get this guy, not just for drug dealing, but for a double drug world felony murder. So he had lied to her in every way imaginable, and he was gone from her life at that moment. She lost not just her husband and everything material that they had, but she'd given up her family and her graduate school career and was pregnant with a baby whose father she would never be able to explain and whose name was unknown to her, other than, of course, in the criminal proceeding, we heard his real name, who cares? But that was the most extreme example I'd ever seen, where someone entered a relationship on a fraudulent basis. Now, does that have anything to do with the everyday world, or is that a strange one-off case? And I think the answer is found in this. Just shy of 40% of relationships that have been formed in the United States over the past 20, 25 years come from internet. People meet over the internet now. There's all sorts of dating services. So that accounts for about 40%.
I have colleagues of, adult professor type people.
Yeah.
Who've met other adult professor type people.
Yeah, exactly. So we all understand why that is in the modern world. No mystery or anything. The problem is there have been some very well done studies on the amount of lying that takes place when people describe themselves. And it's significant. Now, it may not be so far as to have false nationality, false accent, false name, everything else in the case I gave you, but it's still significant if you're fraudulent on the way into a relationship as to who you really are, what you really believe, what you stand for, what you own, what you've accomplished, what people think of you. When you tell those kind of lies, they lie around at the base of a relationship very significantly. They sort of remind me of ordnance that's unexploded, that a bomb that's dropped from a plane, it goes in the mud and it isn't found for 20 years until some unlucky children find it and play with it, and then accidents happen.
Yeah. Just to put a ribbon around the story that you shared about this con man drug dealer, your client was the pregnant mother, is that right?
Yes.
And what were you able to achieve in that situation? What was your goal? Was this did this have any happy outcome or not? Maybe that's why it's not in the book.
No, it was a one-day relationship or 1 week or something, at least, because I couldn't do anything. I mean, it turned out that I advised her that the police were right. They had the guy, they had the evidence. I don't know how to tell you this, ma'am, but you know, your husband is a completely different person than
Uh-huh.
you thought he was, and everything you guys own jointly has been seized as the product of the ill-begotten gains of his drug
Oh
dealing.
my goodness. Yeah.
But that was the end. No, once I learned that, and turned the case over to a criminal attorney, not my specialty.
Yeah.
So it was a very brief legal relationship, but it certainly was the highest degree of fraud I'd ever seen. I mean, it was essentially 100%
Yeah.
fraudulent relationship.
Wow. Okay, let's move along to pile number 4, obstructed connections.
So that's simply when there's too much else going on in people's lives. I use the word obstructed because I once came out of my law office in downtown Boston, and the workmen were removing a huge water pipe from the street, big, long, wide thing. And I happened to look in the end of it, and it was maybe 80% clogged uh, with this, rock hard looking material, and that's why they were replacing it. And I think that people's lives get clogged, especially in our hyper super busy world. And the story I tell is about a little boy who at Boston Children's Hospital, who was in there for cancer, and a very serious case that would eventually take his life. And he had told his pediatrician that he wanted to talk to a lawyer because there were legal issues involved. So this the head of pediatrics there is a personal friend. He called me up and said, You're like the only lawyer I know personally. Can you come talk to this 10-year-old? I have no idea why he wants to talk to a lawyer. So when I get in there, the 10-year-old, who had about as much charm as a mountain has weight, said that his parents couldn't really love him successfully, and he thought there was a legal issue, which it turned out there was. And could I look into it for him? And I will never forget the way he phrased it, as only a 10-year-old could put it. He said, I know my mom loves me, but she does love the way a flashlight shines light when it's about to lose its batteries. It doesn't help you see in the dark. It's
Wow.
just a glow.
Wow.
Yeah. Um, so that was people gets, and the father was a one of these finance guys, mezzanine finance, venture capital. The next deal was more important to him than this wonderful little boy who was his only child to boot.
What was the legal issue, if I may ask?
Well, I don't want to spoil the story for those who will read the book, but what happened was the mother had been involved in a very serious crime 30, 30 or 35 years earlier
Oh my,
as a college student. And she'd lived with this in her head ever since, and was just lived in raw fear that the police would figure out who she was one day and come knocking at her door. And she had become the mayor of a small town, mayor equivalent,
wow.
a small town outside of Boston. Uh, so she had quite a wonderful life, except she lived in raw fear that this crime would come popping up. And my job as her attorney was to find a way to see if we couldn't negotiate an end to that liability by dealing with the criminal authorities.
Okay. And the 5th pile is dangerous connections.
And there, I deal with a classic case of spousal abuse. Um, One of the things that people who work with abused, particularly abused wives, occasionally it's gender reversed in about 15% cases, but basically it's the women because they're smaller, and it's physically more likely to be beaten up by the male. Um, and one of the hardest things to understand is why battered wives don't leave sooner.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing for me in this book was because there is a connection. It's not like a hostage situation where there's no connection other than the guy has a gun, and as soon as he leaves, or the police arrest him, you're done and you leave and you have nothing to do with him or anybody else who was your co-hostage. This is the opposite. There is a connection. It's just a dangerous one. So wives forgive battering husbands somewhat in parallel to how other wives forgive alcoholism or gambling addiction, other issues,
Hmm.
and return for more and more rounds. It's not the only reason they stay. It's also financially hard to leave. It's frightening to leave because these violent men can be very dangerous if you try to leave and escape and
Yeah.
tell your story. But it's just a reminder that sometimes we're involved in connections that are dangerous. For example, people have friends who are involved in criminal activities and sometimes get too close to the criminal activities because their friends need a little help before or after the event. And I've seen people dragged down by that.
Okay. You make a distinction between what you call subjective loneliness versus objective loneliness. What are you getting at there?
Is just another way of phrasing the difference between people who come to loneliness because they're subjectively they have a problem, but they actually have relationships. They may be married, they may have children, and so on, as opposed to people who live entirely alone. About 28% of the US population uh, now lives alone. That's at 2018 numbers of the adult population, so not counting college students. So there's a lot of opportunity to feel terribly lonely because you live alone. And of course, in these days of the coronavirus isolation, one can't help but think of what it feels like to lose all the little everyday conversations that we're all used to in the streets or passing people in a store and so on. Uh, what that feels like to people who have no one at home, who really have no one who cares,
Yeah.
no one to care for, no one who telephones you, no one to call.
Yeah. Yeah. I want to come back to the pandemic if we have time. Um, you have a sense of the best therapeutic approach for treating people who are suffering from loneliness?
Well, I think a therapist probably will find more detail, and so it'll depend on the detail. But I think it's important to try to get people to replace some of the interactions they're losing with, for example, modern media. That's obvious. We're all zoomed out and so on, trying to keep up with people. But that's an important use of this modern technology. Quite the opposite from the teenager buried in the phone who doesn't even bother to really deal with his friends. They'll just text one another. So that's one thing. But another thing to do is to talk about things and encourage parents to talk about absences. For example, grandparents. This is a classical circumstance where grandparents are losing vast amounts of time with grandchildren. And at least in my social psychology uh, worldview, grandparents play an important role for grandchildren. I think parents teach children how to connect and how to find love in the world, just like birds teach little birds how to fly and how to find their food source. When we hug and kiss and caress and soothe our babies, as parents, we're teaching them about, we're not just teaching them to go seek friendship and love on their own, but actually building their connective pathways. We're actually building the equipment inside of them that they will use to venture out and connect with others. Grandparents, I think, play a different role. I think that grandparents are all about teaching children about their roots, about where their parents and therefore they come from. So
Mm-hmm.
if a child's not seeing their grandparents because of this, I think it's really important for a clinician to tell a parent who brings this up, talk about your grandparents, bring out those old pictures, talk about what your grandparents when they were 5-year-olds, and one of the advantages of the older world was we all have a cardboard box of old photographs.
Yeah.
Bring them out. Show what did granddad look like when he was 5 years old. That's all about roots and all about the cycles of life. So I think it's really important for parents to recognize how much children are losing in this way. And I would name one other way. I think it's enormously important phase of life when children interact with each other in free play, in unstructured free play. I think that's where they learn how to connect and how to try to make friends, how to try to enter circles of friends, how to tolerate rejection when they're not welcome, how to identify the local bully, how to deal with a local bully. All these skills children pick up through free play in unstructured activity. So to the extent that's missing these days, parents need to try to think about these topics. There are books and of course these days even videos and so on to help children learn these issues. If they can't learn them on the playground or on the down the street by knocking on Jimmy's door, given the separation I suppose we're all going to be living with for the coming few years or whatever, then do your best to raise these issues with your children.
Yeah, I wanted to mention your second book, which is in fact about children, and it's Growing Up Lonely, Disconnection and Misconnection in the Lives of Our Children. And you do talk about some of the challenges that have been created by technology and so on, some of the downsides of that, which is a topic of great interest to me, but we don't have time to go into it. So speaking of the epidemic that we're going through right now, what are your thoughts about loneliness and the current COVID-19 pandemic? And how does that, how does this topic interact with what's going on, and what do you see down the line?
Well, I think there's both sides of the coin, if you like. Obviously, it exacerbates loneliness to the extent any of us are lonely. And by the way, I distinguish loneliness, everyday loneliness, from chronic loneliness.
Yeah.
So we're all lonely from time to time. We lose our grandparents when we're in our 20s or 30s. We lose our parents when we're in our 50s or 60s. And in the modern world, we lose friends all along the route because they pick up and move across the country and so on. So there's a lot of loss in everyday life, and therefore a lot of feelings of missing people who we care dearly about. So we all experience loneliness, but we don't all experience chronic loneliness. We all experience sadness, but we don't all experience clinical depression. So I'm talking about chronic loneliness,
Yeah.
people who are the equivalent on that issue of a clinically depressed person. So for those type of people, this is obviously a threatening environment. If they're, to the extent they're boxed up at home alone, with nobody to call, nobody to Zoom with, nobody who cares, nobody to care for, obviously that's got to be super hard on them. And there's already one little study that's been done confirming how problematic that is, no surprise. For those of us who are not chronically lonely, we don't have that, we don't present with that psychological issue. It's still cutting us off from interactions with friends and colleagues in a significant way. And I think it, on one hand, creates issues because we rely on these interactions as social animals. On the other hand, perhaps, I'm hoping at any rate, that we all learn a lesson about how important it is to maintain our relationships. Everything takes maintenance, right? Everybody who has a house or a car understands that. You've got to get things oiled and greased and fill of gas and change the broken this or that. That's just the name of the game. That's true in relationships too. So it's really important. And I hope that this is a learning experience for people about doing what I call relational due diligence, thinking through how they're doing in their relationships. And there's some wonderful tools to help people through this. Dr. Amy Banks, who has a paper in that edited book that you showed, Growing Up Lonely, has a wonderful 20 question questionnaire in there, and you'll learn a lot about each of your relationships that you put through that stress test to see how you're doing.
Wow.
So taking a hard look at your relationships, maintaining them by doing what you need to do, like calling, flying out, getting together, making plans, so on, and having the courage to strike out and make new relationships to replace some that that just pass through our lives. Those are the things we each need to do, and I'm hoping that the isolation we've all experienced makes that rather obvious.
Well, that's good to have a positive, possible positive outcome from all of this that we're going through. And we are running into the boundary of our time together, but it's been very informative and very delightful. So, Dr. Terry, Dr. J.W. Freiberg, I want to thank you for being my guest today on Shrink Wrap Radio.
It's been my pleasure.